The Monad and Other Essays Upon the Higher Consciousness by C.W. Leadbeater, published in 1920. Foreword. The essays included in this book are all upon subjects which it is of the highest importance that our students should try to understand. They have appeared during the last 7 years in various magazines, and I have been asked to put them all together in a permanent form, convenient for reference. Hence, this volume. Part 1 of Chapter 1, The Monad. The information available on the subject of the monad is necessarily scanty. We are not, at the present, in a position to supplement it to any great extent, but a statement of the case, as far as it is at the present comprehended among us, may save students some misapprehensions. Such are often manifested in the questions that are sent in to us. That many misconceptions should exist on such a subject is inevitable, because we are trying to understand the physical brain, what can't be possible to be expressed in terms intelligible to that brain. The monad inhabits the second plane of our sets of planes, that which used to be called the paravonic or the anupadak, or the parentless, barren realms. It is not as easy to attach in the mind any definite meaning to the word plane or world at such an altitude as this, because any attempt even to symbolize the relation of planes or worlds to one another demands a stupendous effort of the imagination in a direction with which we are wholly unfamiliar. Let us try to imagine what the consciousness of the divine must be, the consciousness of the solar deity altogether, outside any of the worlds or planes or levels which we have ever conceived. We can only arguably think of some sort of transcendent consciousness for which space no longer exists, to which everything in the solar system is simultaneously present, not only in its actual condition, but at every stage of its evolution, from the beginning to the end. We must think of that divine consciousness as creating for its use these worlds of various types of matter, and then voluntarily veiling itself within the matter, and thereby greatly limiting itself. By taking upon itself a garment of the matter of even the highest of the worlds, it has clearly already imposed upon itself a certain limitation, and equally clear, each additional garment assumed, as it involves itself more and more deeply within matter, must increase the limitation. One way of attempting to symbolize this is to try to think of it in connection with what we call dimensions of space. If we may suppose an infinite number of these dimensions, it may be suggested that each descent from a higher level to a lower removes the consciousness of one of these dimensions until we reach the mental plane or world. The power of observing but 5 of them is all that is left to us. The descent to the astral level takes away 1 more, and further descent to the physical leaves us with the 3 which are familiar to us. In order even to get an idea of what this loss of additional dimension means, we have to suppose that the existence of a creature whose senses are capable of comprehending only 2 dimensions. Then we must reason in what respect the consciousness of that creature would differ from ours, and thus try to imagine to ourselves what it would mean to lose a dimension from our consciousness. Such an exercise of the imagination will speedily convince us that the 2-dimensional creature could never obtain any adequate conception of our life at all. He could be conscious of it only in sections, and his idea of even those sections must be entirely misleading. This enables us to see how inadequate must be our conception of even of the plane or world next above us, and we at once perceive the hopelessness of expecting fully to understand the monad, which is raised by many of these planes or worlds above the point from which we are trying to regard it. It may help us if we recall to our minds the method in which the deity originally built these planes. We speak with all reverence in regard to this method, realizing fully that we can at most comprehend only the minutest fragment of this work, and that even that fragment is seen by us from below, while it looks upon it from above. Yet we are justified in saying that it sends forth from itself a wave of power, of influence of some sort, which molds the primeval pre-existent matter into certain forms to which we give the name atoms. Into that world or plane or level so made comes a second life wave of divine energy. To it, those atoms already existing are objective, outside of itself, and builds them into forms which it inhabits. Meantime, the first down-flowing wave comes yet again, sweeping through that newly formed plane or level, and makes yet another lower plane, with atoms a little larger and matter therefore a little denser, even though its density may as yet be far rarer than our finest conception of matter. Then into the second world comes the second outflowing, and again in that finds matter which to it is objective, and builds of that its own forms. And so this process is repeated, and the matter grows denser and denser with each world or level, until at last we reach this physical level. But it will help us if we bear in mind that each of these levels, the ensouling life of the second outpouring, finds matter already vivified by the first outpouring, which it regards as objective, of which it builds the forms which it inhabits. This process of ensouling forms built out of already vivified matter is continued all through the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. But when we come to the moment of individualization, which divides the highest animal manifestation from the lowest human, a curious change begins to take place. That which has hitherto been ensouling life becomes itself in turn the ensouled, for it builds itself into a form, symbolized as the cup or the Holy Grail, into which the ego then enters, of which he takes possession. He absorbs it into himself, all the experiences which the matter of his causal body has had, so that nothing whatever is lost, and then he carries these on with him throughout the ages of his existence or incarnations. He continues the process of forming bodies on lower planes out of material ensouled by the first outpouring from the third aspect of the deity, but he finally reaches a level in evolution in which the causal body's the lowest that he needs, and when this is attained, we have the spectacle of the ego, which represents the third outpouring from the first aspect of the deity, inhabiting a body composed of matter ensouled by the second outpouring. At a far later stage, the earlier happening repeats itself once more, and the ego, who has ensouled so many forms during the whole of the chain period, becomes himself the vehicle, and is ensouled in his turn by the now fully active and awakened monad. Yet here as before, nothing whatever is lost from the economy of nature. All the manifold experiences of the ego, all of the splendid qualities developed in him, all these pass into the monad himself, and find there a vastly fuller realization than even the ego could have given them. On the condition of consciousness of the solar deity outside the planes of this system, we can form no true conception. It has been spoken of as the divine fire, And if for a moment we adopt that time-honored symbolism, we may imagine that sparks from that fire fall into matter of our planes, sparks which are the essence of that fire, but yet appear temporarily separated from it. The analogy cannot be pushed too far, because all sparks of which we know anything are thrown out from their parent fire, and gradually fade and die, whereas these sparks develop by slow evolution into flames, and return to the parent fire. This development and this return are apparently the objects for which the sparks come forth, and the process of the development is that which we are at the present moment concerned to try to understand. It seems that the spark, as such, cannot in its entirety veil itself beyond a certain extent. It cannot descend beyond what we call the second plane and yet retain its unity. One difficulty with which we are confronted in trying to form any ideas upon this matter is that, as yet, none of us who investigate are able to raise our consciousness to this second plane. In the nomenclature recently adopted, we give it the name of the monadic because it is the home of the monad. None of us have yet been able to realize that the monad in its own habitation, but only to see it when it has descended one stage to the plane or level or world below its own, in which it shows itself as the triple spirit, which in our earlier books we call the Atma in man. Even already he is incomprehensible, for he has three aspects which are quite distinct and apparently separate, and yet they are fundamentally one and the same. The monad in its first aspect cannot, or at least does not, descend below that spiritual level, but in its second aspect it does descend into the matter of the next lower world, the intuitional. And when that aspect is drawn around itself, the matter of that level, we call it divine wisdom in man, or the intuition. Meanwhile, the monad in its third aspect descends also to that intuitional plane and clothes itself in its matter, and adopts a form to which as yet no name has been attached in our literature. It then moves forward or downward one more stage, and then clothes itself in the matter of the higher mental world, and then we call it the intellect in man. When that threefold manifestation on the three levels has thus developed itself and shows itself as spirit, intuition, and intellect, we give it the name of the ego, and that ego takes upon itself a vehicle built of matter of the higher mental plane, to which we give the name of the causal body. This ego, so functioning in its causal body, has often been called the higher self, and sometimes also the soul. We see the ego then be a manifestation of the monad on the higher mental plane, but we must understand that it is infinitely far from being a perfect manifestation. Each descent from plane to plane means much more than just a mere veiling of the spirit. It means an actual diminution in the amount of spirit expressed. To use terms denoting quantity in speaking of such matters is entirely incorrect and misleading. Yet, if an attempt is made to express these higher matters in human words at all, these incongruities cannot be wholly avoided. And the nearest that we can come, in the physical brain, to a conception of what happens when the monad involves himself in matter of the spiritual plane, is to say that only part of it can possibly be shown there, and that even that part must be shown in three separate aspects, instead of in one glorious totality, which it really is in its own world. So when the second aspect of the triple spirit comes down a stage and manifests as intuition, It is not the whole of that aspect which so manifests, but only a fraction of it. So again, when the third aspect descends 2 planes and manifests itself as intellect, it is only a fraction of what the intellect aspect of the monad really is. Therefore, the ego is not a veiled manifestation of the monad, but a veiled representation of a minute portion of the monad. As above, so below. As the ego is to the monad, so is the personality to the ego. So that by the time we have reached the personality with which we have to deal in the physical world, the fractionization has been carried so far that the part that we are able to see bears no appreciable proportion to the reality of which it is, nevertheless, the only possible representation for us. Yet it is with and from this ridiculously inadequate fragment that we are endeavoring to comprehend the whole. Our difficulty in trying to understand the monad is the same in kind, but much greater in degree, is that which we find when we really try to grasp the idea of the ego, which we will attempt to grasp in Part 2 of Chapter 1, The Monad, by C.W. Leadbeater. Please support the channel and future creations by subscribing, liking, sharing, commenting, donate if you feel so led, and until the next time, always remember, love yourselves and love each other unconditionally.